When PlayStation 3 was announced, Sony promised the arrival of 1080p gaming in the home. While it didn't go quite as planned, some developers never stopped believing, and I've made it my mission to document as many 1080p games on the PlayStation 3 as possible. After previously showcasing the first 4 years of the PS3's 1080p life, however, it's time to tackle 2010, 2011, and 2012. So join me for part 3 of our PS3 1080p extravaganza. Let's get started. So 2010 is a weird one. There was a lot of stuff happening this year, but in the world of 1080p games, this is far and away the least packed year of the bunch. Sony did have a particularly strong E3 showing, I think, with this rather amusing presentation from Kevin Butler though.
Because every gamer is a true gamer. Motion gamers, sitting gamers, everyone. And though we may pledge fanboy allegiances to different flags, deep down inside we all serve one master, one king. And his name is gaming. Forever may he reign!
This was also the year that Sony would introduce support for stereoscopic 3D in games, a short-lived fad that gave us some cool results, I think. Even games like Wipeout 3D, Stardust HD, and Ridge Racer 7 would receive updates for stereoscopic 3D, with a lot more to come. For 1080p gamers though, there wasn't that much to choose from this year. That's not to say there aren't any. Take Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. Yes, it's a 2D pixel art game, but I wanted to highlight it specifically for one reason. It takes advantage of 1080p to enhance its pixel upscaling. And this is key because games like Mega Man 9, which do offer 1080p output, still utilize blurring and filtering, resulting in a very soft image. Scott Pilgrim does not take this approach and instead presents razor-sharp artwork that looks absolutely fantastic. This is the way scaling should be done at 1080p. The quality of the animation and background work is also phenomenal and cannot be understated. That said, the game itself does let me down in some key areas, and replaying it kind of reminded me of this. It lacks proper grappling, the knockdowns and stage design are both way too long at times, and it doesn't quite match the finesse of truly classic brawlers. That said, for 2010, this was pretty excellent, and better than most on the market, plus it has an absolutely wonderful soundtrack. So just for the quality of its scaling and visual work, I wanted to give this one 750p's out of 1080. The score is really only held down by the fact that it's basically a low-res pixel art game, but hey, I think it counts. Next up though is yet another brawler, and this time it's a PS3 port of Castle Crashers, a once Xbox 360 arcade exclusive. This one also supports 1080p, but the results are perhaps less impressive. You see, it's clear that some of the art was designed for that lower res HD output, and as a result, you have this weird mix of razor-sharp 2D elements with slightly filtered elements within a single scene. So while it does benefit from 1080p, it doesn't exactly take full advantage of it. It also runs at just 30 frames per second, which honestly isn't acceptable for a 2D game like this. Castle Crashers was pretty popular back when it was new, but looking at it through a modern lens, I see now that it's actually a rather subpar brawler. The mechanics are very simple and it's extremely repetitive. That's not to say you can't have a good time in multiplayer mode, of course. As a result though, this one receives just 450 points. It looks clean and nice enough, but ultimately it doesn't impress nor take full advantage of 1080p. One that released earlier in the year though that I wanted to mention briefly is this, Zoldner X2 Final Prototype. This is a horizontal shooter with some interesting visual elements that kind of remind me of games like Polestar on the Neo Geo. Essentially, it uses a lot of pre-rendered graphics displayed at high frame rates, leading to a smooth, almost hypnotic look in motion. Now, the game boasts 1080p output, and technically it does produce 1080p, but it's also limited by the resolution of the core assets. It is pre-rendered after all. Now it's reasonably sharp and clean in motion, I suppose, but clearly the art assets themselves were not created specifically to take advantage of this higher resolution. And this is the reason why I wanted to mention it here, because in my mind it was always a 1080p game, and looking at the documentation around it, it also seems like it was intended to be. But looking closer, I'm not so convinced. Thus, while the game does indeed look pretty nice, I have to give it a lower score due to its seemingly upscaled assets. It comes in at 450 points, just like Castle Crashers. Up next, released in October, this is Aqua Panic, which was originally released in 2008 for other platforms, but finally made its way to PlayStation 3 in 2010. It's another small-scale puzzle game, but this one is surprisingly fun. It's basically a combination of Lemmings with The Incredible Machine, where you use various tools to redirect the flow of water in an attempt to save all the fish. But I'm not a huge fan of the art direction, and the water simulation updates at just half rate, so it doesn't look especially great in motion. Even still, the artwork is all displayed at native 1080p, so it's very crisp, and the scrolling and cursor movement happens at 60 frames per second. As a result, I'll be generous and award this one 530 Ps out of 1080, because why not? Another October release then is Dead Space Ignition, but don't get too excited. Ignition is basically a pre-order bonus for Dead Space 2 and more of a visual novel combined with a puzzle game. It features a range of logic and twitch-based challenges to solve while telling its story using these motion comic sequences. It's entertaining enough, but certainly not inspiring. All of the puzzle stuff though is displayed at native 1080p, so it looks very crisp. It is, however, very simplistic in its visual design, so it's certainly not a showcase for 1080p output. The game itself is also very basic and really only serves as a pre-order bonus for Dead Space fans rather than working as a real standalone game, though I believe it was also available as that. As a result, I'll hand this one just 500 out of 1080. It gets the job done, but doesn't really go far beyond this. Another one I want to mention quickly then are the two special edition versions of Monkey Island. That's right, the first two games in the Monkey Island series received enhanced re-releases. The first actually arrived in 2009, but the one I want to talk about, the second game, arrived in 2010. I greatly prefer the second special edition in terms of overall visual style and features such as a commentary track, but both of them offer a wonderful retro mode that lets you seamlessly switch between the original pixel art and the remade visuals. And thankfully, you get a nice 1080p output, which works extremely well with the new artwork, but also allows the retro mode to scale up nicely to 1080p with super crisp pixels. The team definitely did a good job with this release. Beyond that, the music implementation was greatly improved from the first special edition, and they recorded all new voices, which sound awesome.
How much wood could a woodchuck chuck if a woodchuck could chuck wood?
A woodchuck could chuck no amount of wood since a woodchuck can't chuck wood.
But if a woodchuck could chuck and would chuck some amount of wood, what amount of wood would a woodchuck chuck?
Even if a woodchuck could chuck wood, and even if a woodchuck would chuck wood, should a woodchuck chuck wood?
Of course, going into the history of Monkey Island and these remakes is beyond the scope of this video, but I did want to at least briefly highlight the second game. Thus, I'll award this one a solid 750 out of 1080. So there's been a lot more games in 2010 thus far, that's for sure, but unfortunately the Full HD scores haven't been great. It started to feel like at this point developers were more interested in targeting advanced graphical features at lower resolutions than aiming for 1080p. Our next one though is what you get when you're perhaps a little overambitious. It begins with this ridiculously ostentatious introduction movie, which starts with a near 4-minute piano solo crafted by the world-famous pianist Lang Lang that delves into the creation of the materials used to build the cars. This is Kazunori Yamauchi at his most extravagant, I think. When you play Gran Turismo 5, you play by his rules. So, Gran Turismo 5, for better or for worse, is basically the largest game in the series as of this point, with an absurd number of events, features, cars, tracks, and modes. It is loaded with stuff to do. Problem is, it was also clear that this was perhaps too much for the team to fully realize. I mean, it took more than half a decade to build the game, and only a percentage of its overall car count are of the so-called premium variety. You know, premium cars feature higher polygon counts with fully modeled interiors designed from the ground up for PlayStation 3. The standard cars, however, available from the used car garage, are lifted from the PlayStation 2 era, with just minor touch-ups and some new wheels. The menu system then is bursting with selectable options presented at full 1080p, but it's kind of loaded to the point of overkill. There's almost too much here for its own good, and everything is divided up by loading screens in a way that makes navigation feel frustrating. Like GT Prologue, Gran Turismo 5 delivers the same 1280 by 1080 rendering resolution with MSAA for 3D elements, while everything else is rendered out at full 1080p. Image quality is actually rather reasonable when you consider the quality of the visuals on display, but there are certainly some caveats. Transparencies, for instance, are rendered at an obscenely low resolution to the point where you'll find yourself bumping up against pixels the size of your fist. Shadows are also very low resolution, and the whole thing just feels like it's a hair beyond the scope of what the PS3 can comfortably deliver. Plus, the initial install can literally take hours to complete, with 27 individual patch files to download, plus of course the actual data install itself. Of course, as of the making of this video, the game's online mode is completely unavailable, but thankfully, it still remains fully playable in single player mode. GT5 did support stereoscopic 3D, however, which comes with a significant hit to resolution, but it's surprisingly effective and impressive to see it included at all. Heck, they even allow for a pseudo head tracking with the PlayStation Eye camera, but alas, it's just the position rather than the direction, so it doesn't really work especially well, but still, the game is just packed with features at every corner, and perhaps that was one of its problems. Speaking of features, certain tracks now feature dynamic time of day and variable weather conditions such as rain. Rain has had an impact on handling as well, so it's not just cosmetic. Plus, as I mentioned earlier, premium cars feature those beautifully realized cockpits complete with functional windshield wipers and everything. Honestly, the whole project is an interesting, ambitious, yet messy package. You can feel that a lot of love was poured into its creation, but it also feels like the point where Polyphony Digital was stretched just a little too thin for its own good. Unfortunately, performance is also stretched too thin for its own good. Gran Turismo was known for delivering a smooth 60 frames per second, at least during the PlayStation 2 era, but the move to PS3, with all these crazy features and high-resolution rendering, is too much. GT5 features some of the most egregious tearing in a big AAA release, and many of its more demanding races struggle to deliver anything resembling a stable 60 FPS. It's really all over the place, just a big choppy mess sometimes, especially in the rain. Still, I can't deny that this is an ambitious and beautiful looking game in many ways, and that alone makes it an interesting game to revisit, even if it is flawed. With its lower resolution target and sheer volume of screen tearing, GT5 scores below the prior two GT entries mentioned today, coming in at 740p's out of 1080. This won't be the last time we see Gran Turismo in this video though. And that's 2010 in a nutshell. A lean year for 1080p to be sure, but I have some thoughts on this. Essentially, in 2010, the new wave of HD remasters, which are ripe for 1080p support by the way, had yet to really kick off, with just a small number of releases here and there. Furthermore, 2D games would begin to see a proper resurgence after this point, and these also make a perfect candidate for 1080p. Alas, with its low scores and low number of games, 2010 comes in at just 595 for the entire year. With this in mind though, let's jump to the next year of PlayStation 3, 2011.
Flying over the middle of the Okami desert, looking for some lost city in the sand. Next thing I know, plane's going down. I'm hanging like a rag doll at 30,000 feet, just trying to hold on.
And a plague on every corner. When half the city hated me, and the other half wanted me dead. He brought out my good side.
I'm telling you, war has changed. So you do what you have to. I'm no hero. But whatever good I've done, it was him.
It was in the days of suffering when the gods made their might known. When no mortal dared stand up to Zeus. He did.
Omaha. Pinned down on that godforsaken beach. Thinking if I lay there, I'll maybe die. But if I get up, there ain't no maybe about it. Then one man broke through. Michael.
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 When the Templars murdered my family. When the whole bloody world's gone crazy. Hellcat, Sector 9, to Michael! Michael! For all he does. For all of us. To Michael. To Michael!
Ah yes, 2011, the start of a new decade, and a new chance for the PlayStation 3 to shine. By now, the PS3 was selling well. The system was more affordable. It had PlayStation Move support and stereoscopic 3D. It seemed like a decent machine, and the campaign with "It Only Does Everything" actually did make some sense. Unfortunately, this was also the year of the PSN hack, where it was down for weeks. An unprecedented event for the industry. There was a decent number of 1080p games released this year too, but most of them didn't even arrive until the second half of the year. This is also the year when the sheer volume of releases actually makes it difficult to track what's really 1080p and what's not. So I'm certain that there are some titles that I may have overlooked for this video, but hey, these are some of the more notable releases at least. The first big 1080p title then is a fantastic little game from Drinkbox known as Tales from Space About a Blob. It's a completely 2D side-scrolling game that kind of reminds me of Loco Roco again, but with a western twist, and it's full HD, 1080p at 60 frames per second. That's why it's on this list, of course. This is the very first game from Drinkbox, and it's delightful. The themes and visual design didn't initially captivate me, but after spending time with it, I walked away impressed. You basically control an alien blob that was stranded on Earth and captured by an evil scientist. You'll roll your way through various stages, increasing your size, Katamari style, while tackling puzzles and obstacles along the way. More importantly, it's displayed at a full native 1080p, allowing its artwork to truly shine. And it even runs at a rock-solid 60 frames per second. So while it's relatively constrained in what it attempts to deliver, it's a nice looking game and a great introduction to the world of Drinkbox. We'll be seeing them again later in this video. As a result though, About a Blob deserves a solid 800 out of 1080 for its clean visual design and smooth frame rate, making it a great way to start 2011 on the PlayStation 3. In June then, we finally arrive at Under Siege. No, not that one. I'm talking about this, a real-time strategy game created for the PlayStation 3. A game which kinda reminds me of Myth: The Fallen Lords, in that you command small armies around various maps from an overhead 3D perspective while tackling objectives along the way. It's more focused on strategy than things like resource gathering, and, at least as far as I've played, it has some nice story sequences as well. This PS3 exclusive is built using the Fire engine, and uses deferred rendering. It was also created by a small Portuguese studio known as Seed. It features a full campaign, plus multiplayer and map creation options. A pretty robust package, if I do say so myself. Amazingly, the team managed to deliver this one at Full HD 1080p with FXAA no less, which was still relatively new for this era. MLAA became far more common on PlayStation 3, so this is interesting. It also features full shadow maps and a rather aggressive but nice looking fog of war effect. Now, it doesn't perfectly nail its performance target, which is 30 frames per second, as it does exhibit mild screen tearing, but honestly, it's not too bad. It's certainly better than something like Sacred 2, and the extra resolution is certainly welcome in an RTS game with a zoomed out camera. It's a small scale game then, but interesting and clearly very well made. As a result, I'll hand this one a solid 700 out of 1080p's. It takes full advantage of 1080p, but struggles a little bit with performance. Next up, how about some familiar territory? This is Motorstorm Apocalypse. I just produced a full episode on this series, but I wanted to briefly mention Apocalypse once again, as technically it is a 1080p game, well, at least as much as Gran Turismo 5 is. So firstly, if you missed that episode, Apocalypse is the third mainline entry in the Motorstorm series, taking place on an island that is, well, falling apart. The big hook here is that major track-changing events can occur mid-race, forcing you to readjust your route to compensate. And it's really cool. For this one, the developers managed to up the resolution from 1280 by 720 to 1280 by 1080 with dynamic resolution scaling, meaning it can actually dip below this point as well. That means we're looking at a resolution similar to Gran Turismo 5, but with DRS and MLAA instead of MSAA. And it works pretty well, I'd argue, but it's definitely not among the sharpest games on this list. It also happens to support stereoscopic 3D, which is a really nice feature, of course. Naturally, given what's happening on screen, this game runs at just 30 frames per second, but honestly, it's adequate for a game like this, especially considering the hardware itself. It's not flawless or anything, but it does a good job maintaining a stable 30. Now, if you want to know more about Motorstorm Apocalypse, I do recommend you check out the full DF Retro episode on that series, but for this episode, I'm going to give this one 750 out of 1080. The next title I'd like to talk about in 2011 though is an HD remaster of a classic series. That's Splinter Cell. Yep, the first 3 Splinter Cell games received the HD remaster treatment exclusively on PlayStation 3, and each game offers a native 1080p mode. The Splinter Cell series was known for pushing technological boundaries back on the original Xbox, and Chaos Theory is widely considered the best of the bunch. The series follows the exploits of Sam Fisher as he infiltrates various locations while dispatching foes along the way. The primary technical feature here centers on the use of light and shadow, with many light sources casting real-time shadows to great effect. This package was released right around the time of the rise of HD remasters, and each game is derived from the respective PC versions of the originals. While it does support 1080p output, this option is actually hidden. I say hidden because by default, all 3 games output at 720p instead, but if you disable 720p as an option at the OS level, the game then will boot in full native 1080p mode. So why would they hide something like this, you ask? Well, it's pretty simple. Performance. The Trilogy does not run well on PlayStation 3 in full HD mode. The entire experience is dragged down by a laughably sluggish frame rate. Chaos Theory is far and away the worst of the bunch, with the frame rate mostly falling below 20 frames per second. It feels awful. The original game fares better and is generally playable at 1080p, but it can still dip pretty hard as well. It's a case where you almost wonder if this option was intended to be the original default setting, but they were unable to lock down the performance and settled for 720p instead. As a result, this is a case where I recommend sticking with 720p, as at least in that case the frame rate is reasonably stable and the game still managed to look great. Honestly, replaying Splinter Cell is an interesting proposition. I loved these games back in the day. They're very rigid, with a focus on trial and error gameplay though, and that can be difficult to return to from a modern perspective. There's also a distinct lack of polish in how events play out, like in Pandora Tomorrow. When you take out this guy's captor, you actually see him pop out of the chair briefly before returning to the chair. That shouldn't have happened, I think. Of the 3, again, Chaos Theory I think holds up the best. Still, this collection is an interesting release and not terrible provided you play in the 720p mode. As a result of its poor 1080p performance, however, I cannot award this one more than 350p's out of 1080. It's honestly a terrible mode that should not have shipped in the game in the first place. Thankfully, our next game fares a lot better. It's the God of War Origins collection from Ready at Dawn. This one is derived from the 2 PSP God of War titles that were also created by Ready at Dawn. The idea? Remaster them into full HD 1080p with plenty of visual upgrades and all the extras you could ask for. While neither game quite reaches the heights of the original PS2 titles, I was always impressed with how well they managed to nail the feeling of God of War in portable form. They are certainly good enough, and even on a console, the games managed to hold up shockingly well. and both titles also deliver full 1080p at 60 frames per second, a dramatic upgrade from the originals on PSP. Performance is fluid, and they even offer support for stereoscopic 3D, since that was kind of a thing during this era. That said, there can be some tearing during certain sequences, specifically in the second game, but overall it's pretty smooth. Beyond this, however, I also love the fact that they went back and redid all of the pre-rendered video clips at a much higher quality than they were on PSP, and they even remade the entire interface for 1080p. Ready at Dawn did a phenomenal job with this collection then, and it would be their last big project prior to shifting development over to The Order 1886 for PlayStation 4, which hadn't yet been announced in 2011. Ultimately, this is a great example of how to do an HD remaster and is not the last of its kind that we'll be seeing in this episode. Thanks to their superlative work on this package then, I award the Origins collection 1020 out of 1080. This is how you do an HD re-release. Just 1 week later, however, a very different game would arrive on digital storefronts. It's Burnout Crash from Criterion Games. And this title serves as the connective tissue between Need for Speed Hot Pursuit, released in 2010, and the upcoming Most Wanted, released in 2012. But it focuses entirely on the crash aspect that was made popular in the Burnout games. This time, the game is viewed from a top-down perspective as you crash and explode your car through various junctions. The name of the game is Aftertouch, controlling your wreckage to score points, and honestly, it's a lot of fun. In building this new game, however, Criterion opted for full 1080p output, but at 30 frames per second, rather than 60 like the actual Burnout games that came before it, though they sometimes did drop the frame rate in crash mode. Furthermore, the game's visual style has been dramatically altered for this game, with more of a cartoony vibe. As a result, it's rather unlike most of Criterion's other works, but definitely worth checking out nonetheless, and it does deliver on the promise of full HD, something that was off the table for their racing games that generation. Thus, Burnout Crash comes in at 850p's out of 1080. If it were 60 FPS, it would definitely be angling for a top spot, but as it is, it's still a solid effort that's firmly in the realm of 1080p. But then just 1 week later, we're treated to our third HD remaster for 2011 with Eco and Shadow of the Colossus from Bluepoint Games, and honestly, this is their best one yet. These games remain beloved to this day after making a huge splash on PlayStation 2, at least for me, and this HD remastering is top tier work. As the title suggests, it includes both Eco and Shadow of the Colossus. Eco is a tremendous puzzle adventure game reminiscent of classics such as Another World or Flashback, with its own unique vibe. The atmosphere and mystery of Eco was mesmerizing at the time, and it was great to revisit it here in full HD 1080p with MLAA no less. Shadow of the Colossus, on the other hand, was one of the most technically ambitious games created for PlayStation 2, but as a result of this, the frame rate was obscenely low. In bringing it to the PS3, however, even Bluepoint was not able to offer this game at full native 1080p, instead opting for 960 by 1080, meaning it doesn't really fit in with most of the other games in this list. That said, it does offer some nice visual improvements, including enhanced motion blur and stable performance. What really impresses me about this collection, though, is Bluepoint's adherence to recreating the original source material. So many of these HD collections were often lacking in terms of replicating certain visual effects. The games would be high res, sure, but they'd be lacking in the more subtle areas. Not so with this one. Everything from the way bloom lighting works to the accumulation blur that gives it that dreamlike appearance is fully intact, and the improvements to the assets are done in a very tasteful fashion. It feels exactly like the original game, even though it's technically enhanced, and that is key. This of course means the frame rate is also capped at 30 frames per second. If I recall, Ueda himself even noted that Eco was specifically designed to use the low resolution mode on PlayStation 2 with a target of 30 FPS in order to present a softer, more ethereal image. If you look at early footage of Eco, that was even running at 60 FPS, but it changed by release. Thus, I can't really criticize Bluepoint for sticking with this target. On top of all this, they even include stereoscopic 3D support, and it's one of my favorite examples from this era. Given all that then, I'd like to award this collection a solid 950 out of 1080. If both games had been Full HD native, it would have been an easy 1080 out of 1080, but as it is, it's still an amazing release. 1 month later, however, we received yet another HD remaster, but this one is a little different. It's a rebirth of the classic Model 2 arcade game, Daytona USA. Yep, the AM2 classic returns on PlayStation 3, offering a full 60 frames per second, just like the original, but at native 1080p. It was the release I had wanted for so long, as we'd never received anything close to an arcade perfect conversion. This one not only delivers the arcade game, it even does so with various enhancements. So as the quintessential early 90s arcade racer then, Daytona USA on PlayStation 3 includes the full arcade experience in addition to an objective-based mode to expand your time with the game. The development team managed to perfectly translate the arcade experience to a home console in this case, and it feels highly authentic. Playing this at full HD 1080p is certainly a treat, but that doesn't mean it's 100% flawless. You see, the team opted to implement mipmaps into the new renderer, a common thing, but it results in a visible dividing line between different mip levels, and anisotropic filtering is not utilized to fix this. What's weird about that though, you ask? It is normal, right? Well, the original Model 2 and Model 3 arcade games never used mipmaps, and while this results in slightly noisier distant textures, it also increases the perceived sense of detail. In fact, AM2 rarely employed mipmaps at all in their games, even on Dreamcast, and thus it would have been great to retain that here. Despite this minor quibble, however, the rest of the package is simply superb, and it's effectively the definitive home console conversion of Daytona USA. As a result, this one earns 1070 out of 1080, losing just 10 points for the decision to use mipmaps. Next up then, the PixelJunk series returns. Okay, so technically PixelJunk Shooter 2 would have released earlier in 2011, but this video is already going so long, and basically this just expands upon the first game, so let's talk about the next one released later in the year, PixelJunk Sidescroller. It's Q Games' take on the side-scrolling shooter formula, and it's a ton of fun, unsurprisingly. Aside from PixelJunk Eden, this is perhaps the series' most abstract game. It's presented within a simulated CRT window, featuring curvature along the edges of the frame and simulated scan lines. Heck, if you look closely, you'll even spot the PixelJunk logo burned into the bottom of the virtual CRT. A nice touch. The visual design itself is designed to mimic vector-based arcade games of the 80s, and even simulates the phosphor trail behind moving objects to great effect. It has this radiant quality that elevates the experience, and it's definitely a game that would benefit from a modern HDR display. Vector monitors, however, present imagery with a pristine quality that cannot be fully replicated on modern displays, or even in normal CRT for that matter. But by utilizing the full resolution of 1080p complete with edge treatment via anti-aliasing, it does manage to feel moderately faithful to this aesthetic. It's exceedingly sharp and clean to the eye, which is typical of PixelJunk games in general, I suppose. The game wraps all of this up in a superb soundscape with music once again crafted by High Frequency Bandwidth, who was also responsible for the audio in PixelJunk Shooter. The final stage in particular is just aurally superb. Naturally, all of this updates at 60 frames per second. It's the target frame rate and the game never misses an update. It's basically flawless. Given all this then, I feel that Sidescroller deserves a solid 1070 out of 1080 as well, just a hair short of the top spot, but very impressive nonetheless. But 2011 isn't stopping yet. On November 15th, Ubisoft would release one of its best games of the era. It's difficult to put into words how meaningful the release of Origins was for me personally. The original Rayman is a longtime favorite of mine, and while I adore Rayman 2, I felt like the series lost its way after that point, due in part to the shift to the third dimension. Origins was the perfect opportunity for a proper two-dimensional rebirth, and series creator Michel Ancel even took the reins on this project. Ubisoft is well known for its in-house technology, and Origins has something special to offer from this perspective as well, as it's the introductory title built using the UbiArt framework, a new set of tools and technologies designed to push 2D vector art graphics at high frame rates across a wide range of platforms, while minimizing the need for programmer support wherever possible. It was a success, and in fact the engine is still used to this day in the Just Dance series. Rayman Origins takes full advantage of this technology, featuring beautifully drawn artwork with a near limitless number of parallax background layers, all scrolling smoothly across each stage. I was skeptical of high-resolution 2D art for platform games at this point, but Rayman Origins demonstrated what was possible with the right team. As a game, Origins is decidedly different from the very first Rayman, focusing more on momentum and speed, but it's packed with cute references that will tickle the fancy of longtime fans. Once you get into its style of gameplay, it really becomes addicting. All of this is presented at Full HD 1080p then, and the artwork itself is beautifully interpolated as well. It's as clean a game as you could ask for during this era. There's simply nothing between you and the game's artwork. More importantly, everything moves at a steady 60 frames per second even as the screen becomes flooded with projectiles and foes alike. It's just so buttery smooth and wonderful to play. What a phenomenal creation, a true masterpiece of its era. And that's not even getting into things like the soundtrack, which is equally superb. As a result then, I can think of no other score than a full 1080 out of 1080p's for Rayman Origins. It is 2D perfected and a wonderful showcase title for any system it would arrive on. Our last game of 2011 then is, you guessed it, another HD remaster, but this time with a twist. This is Tekken Hybrid, a disc which includes a demo of Tekken Tag 2, an entire Tekken movie, and an HD remaster of Tekken Tag Tournament based on the PlayStation 2 version, and that's what we're discussing today. The existence of this disc is what makes this unique. So Tekken Tag was one of the premier launch titles for PlayStation 2 in the West, building on the success of Soul Calibur for Dreamcast by fully rebuilding the arcade game with entirely new visuals targeting the more powerful PlayStation 2. It was a huge success and remains a gorgeous title to this day. The PlayStation 3 version of Tekken Tag Tournament is interesting then. It recreates the PS2 original faithfully, but does so at, expectedly, a higher resolution. It is not, however, Full HD 1080p. Rather, it seems to be 1536 by 1080. Why 1536, you ask? Well, divide that by 3 and you get 512, which is a common horizontal resolution for PlayStation 2 games, so perhaps there's a connection there. Either way, despite the lower resolution, it still looks very crisp and arguably better than Tekken Dark Resurrection. Remember, Tekken Tag utilizes character models with a higher polygon count than Tekken 5, as that fifth game would focus on more complex arenas which ate into the polygon budget. As you'd expect, however, everything moves at 60 frames per second without even a hint of slowdown. It's perfect, but again, you'd expect nothing less, right? With that said, I feel that Tekken Tag HD deserves 850p's out of 1080, falling slightly below the earlier Dark Resurrection given its time frame, but still offering a solid upgrade all around. With that, however, the year comes to a close. And the grand total for this year is 863. It would have been a lot higher, I think, if Splinter Cell hadn't released this year. So it's fair to say that 2011 was a very good year for PlayStation 3 then. Plenty of original games released alongside some killer HD remasters and even some unexpected rebirths. We didn't know it at the time though, but by the end of 2011, we were less than 2 years away from the release of the next PlayStation console with PlayStation 4. So what did 2012 hold for us? Let's find out. 2012, the year the world would end, supposedly. Yeah, it didn't happen, but what did happen was the arrival of new systems. PlayStation Vita launched in the West for one, and Nintendo would unleash the Wii U. Unfortunately, Vita only meant life to everyone but Sony, and it didn't fare quite as well as I might have hoped, and the same could also be said of the Wii U. Sony also announced and released the PS3 Super Slim, which is extra small compared to the original unit, but wasn't beloved due to the change in loading mechanism. So in that sense, it was a good year for new machines, even if they didn't fully succeed, but on PlayStation 3, it was a little less exciting, given that we were fast approaching the end of the generation, even if we didn't fully know it yet. That doesn't mean there weren't some good titles though, so let's get into those. Our first big 2012 release for PlayStation 3 is the Pinball Arcade from developer Farsight Studios. This one is designed to simulate real pinball tables licensed from other manufacturers. It would go on to feature various seasons, each with a large collection of available tables. Now, the history of digital pinball games is an interesting subject unto itself, and it's something I'd love to cover in the future. But this particular game is just one part of it, and it's a game that focuses on simulating real pinball. And of course, in the realistic pinball space, the other main competitor is Zen Pinball. But Zen Pinball didn't make this list since, based on my testing at least, the PlayStation 3 versions are limited to 720p. That's what separates the two. The Pinball Arcade delivers a full native 1080p experience instead, and it's glorious. This is a case where resolution does matter. Specifically, as a result of the camera work in these games, digital pinball benefits from as many pixels as possible in order to accurately recreate the finer details of these real-life tables. By targeting 1080p, the Pinball Arcade really stands out in terms of overall clarity against the competition. Furthermore, the game targets 60 frames per second, which honestly is a must for any digital pinball experience, and it nails this one with ease. Now, of course, this game would go on to receive a conversion for the yet unannounced PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, but PS3 already offered a great experience in 2012, and it still holds up brilliantly. But our next game is another small-scale indie title known as Dyad. It borrows a page from the book of Jeff Minter, delivering a hybrid of racing and shooting down a high-speed tunnel. You basically grapple from one enemy to the next, chaining together your actions as you move down said tunnel, while jamming out to some great music created by David Kanaga. Of course, with this sort of aesthetic, more resolution helps tremendously. Like several other games I've discussed over the course of this video, Dyad targets native 1080p for its output. The sharp lines and vibrant colors all work in tandem to deliver something that looks simply outstanding in motion. It of course delivers 60 frames per second as well, as you'd expect from a game like this. It's definitely an attractive looking game. Next then, we have Double Dragon Neon from WayForward, a modern take on Double Dragon that has a lot of heart. You know WayForward, of course, the creators of the Shantae series. Well, up until this point, they hadn't released many games on PlayStation 3, just an HD version of A Boy and His Blob and Blood Rain Betrayal. While Blob does support 1080p upscaling, the actual artwork is much lower resolution, while Blood Rain is just a 720p game. Double Dragon Neon, however, makes the jump to Full HD 1080p and offers some significant visual changes over these prior two games. The backgrounds are still sharp, beautifully drawn 2D, but the characters are now created from 3D polygons. They're stylized, of course, to match the backgrounds, but they're 3D. The visual design works pretty well, I think, but the animation is a little too fluid for its own good and feels out of place. I think it would have been better served by a keyframe approach similar to the Guilty Gear Xrd games. I wouldn't go so far as to say it's a stunning game, but I do appreciate the aesthetic and it does hold up surprisingly well. It also plays better than most other games in the Double Dragon series. Sorry, it's true. And it features a tremendously catchy soundtrack from Jake Kaufman. Just listen to this. So yeah, it's full 1080p, and like many other games today, also full 60 frames per second. But you may have noticed that I didn't hand out a full HD score for the last two games, and the reason is simple. Double Dragon Neon, Dyad, and the Pinball Arcade all earn a cool 930p's out of 1080. And it also highlights something that's become somewhat of a trend in this video. If you haven't noticed, many of the games outputting 1080p also manage to do this at 60 frames per second. I point this out as it's another example of what you get when you balance visual quality and performance. It's about hitting those targets set early in the project and aiming for it throughout development. 1080p 60 absolutely is realistic on PS3, as we've seen many times now. While we're talking about 60 FPS, I also want to briefly mention a game called Rainbow Moon, a strategy RPG developed by SideQuest Studios, the same team behind the Zoldner X games. Unlike Zoldner X, however, this one comes a lot closer to realizing the 1080p dream at 60 FPS, with artwork that appears slightly sharper. It's played from an isometric point of view and features strategy RPG-like battle sequences. Now, I admit I haven't spent that much time with this one, but it does seem like a solid little game. The key here is that it offers both 1080p output and 60 FPS this time, serving again as an example of a small studio producing solid results on the PS3 at this resolution. In that sense, I will give this one a score of 500 versus the 450 of Zoldner X2, as it does take better advantage of the resolution, but if you look closely, it's still a little soft compared to many of the sharper titles on this list today. But hey, at least it's 60 FPS. Of course, our next game doesn't quite go for 60 FPS, but it's still quite lovely. It's Okami HD, the classic game from Clover reborn on PlayStation 3. Okami is a fantastic and unbelievably lengthy action RPG created by Clover, with a gorgeous, cel-shaded art style. It was originally developed for PlayStation 2, but arrived on the Wii in due time in somewhat compromised form, but the HD version is a dramatic improvement over both. It was created by Hexadrive and really delivers where it counts. But this case is unique, as it was long rumored that the game rendered internally at 2160p or native 4K due to a misunderstanding of a presentation written by the developer. While it does suggest that the internal resolution is actually 4K, in reality I'm not sure that's the case. Instead, it appears to use 4x MSAA at 1920 by 1080. I think it's the description of MSAA that's throwing everyone off. It just so happens that it's a perfect fit for a game like this, and similar to Echochrome, it winds up looking almost super sampled at a glance. Like the original, however, Okami HD is limited to just 30 frames per second, which is initially disappointing, but ultimately not a huge deal in the end given the nature of the game. The image quality is more important than the frame rate in this unique case. The big complaint I have about this HD re-release though is that there's no option for skipping cutscenes, and many of these scenes drag on far too long. The introduction alone is nearly half an hour. Although, considering the length of this video, I really shouldn't be one to talk, I suppose. Given the quality of its conversion then, I feel this one deserves 980p's out of 1080. It's close to perfection, but a few extra features could have really pushed it over the top. This is Retrograde, a twist on the side-scrolling shooter genre that fuses music gaming with a shooter. The idea? You play through the last section of a stage as a shooter, the credits roll, and then the game rewinds. To restore the time-space continuum, for whatever reason, you basically need to duplicate your actions in reverse. and this is where it basically turns into a music game. You'll have to avoid enemy shots while tapping the fire button on your shots to pull them back into your ship. Certainly an interesting concept. And of course, impressively, this one delivers full HD 1080p at 60 frames per second, but not just that. It also has this gorgeous per pixel motion blur and impressive shadow quality. Honestly, given all this, it's a genuinely impressive looking game to behold, and I almost wish they'd tackled a proper shooter with this technology as well. Given everything we've seen then, I have to give this one a cool 980 out of 1080. Only the limited scope really holds it down, but it's an impressive piece of engineering on the PS3.
PlayStation 3
The last games I'd like to touch on for 2012 then are a trio of Sega Arcade conversions: the groundbreaking Virtua Fighter 2, the fast-paced Fighting Vipers, and the stylish Sonic the Fighters. Each of these games were crafted around the Sega Model 2 arcade board, delivering cutting-edge visuals back in the 90s. I still remember experiencing Virtua Fighter 2 for the very first time at a local arcade. I had already been floored by the likes of Daytona USA by this point, but Virtua Fighter 2 seemed like something that shouldn't even exist. The arcade board could effortlessly draw these richly detailed 3D characters during an era when stuff like Star Fox and Super NES was still relatively new. There was nothing like this on home consoles or PCs alike. Even features such as texture filtering simply hadn't been seen in real-time games prior to Model 2. Fighting Vipers and Sonic then really pushed things further with more detailed arenas full of animation and even some clever shadow casting tricks. Gaze in awe as the shadow of the arena shifts around in real time as the semi-truck in the distance drives past. Or check out the squash and stretch animation in Sonic the Fighters. It was really unique and cool looking for the time. And these PS3 conversions are nearly as well made as Daytona USA from the prior year. The only caveat here is that unlike Daytona, these games are presented in their original 4:3 aspect ratio, but the actual rendering resolution is indeed Full HD 1080p. It's razor sharp. That doesn't mean there aren't some neat tricks possible here. There are 3 screen sizes available, and if you choose the full option, it stretches the image to fill a widescreen display, which isn't optimal, right? But if you change the aspect ratio on your TV to 4:3, you'll actually benefit from mild super sampling, as you're anamorphically squeezing the image back to the correct 4:3 aspect ratio. This of course also eliminates the blue bars that were present under the normal circumstances. Now all 3 games run at 60 frames per second without hiccups in performance, and this is key because the original arcade board actually outputs 57 Hz or thereabouts. Of course, the real-time introduction sequence in VF2 does seem to update at this lower rate, it should be noted, likely trying to maintain timing, but the actual gameplay is full 60 frames per second. Honestly, I only wish Sega had continued this trend of porting Model 2 games to home consoles, or even jumping over to Model 3. The quality of this work is simply outstanding. Also worth mentioning that Cyber Troopers Virtual On received the same treatment in 2013 exclusively on the Japanese PSN. It's exactly like these other games, which is to say really good. With the quality of these conversions in mind then, I want to hand all 3 of these games 1050 out of 1080p's. Just below Daytona due to the lack of native widescreen support and special objective modes, but they're still fantastic. And they're cheap, go buy them before they're gone. But with that, we've tackled the key games I wanted to cover for 2012. While lean on number of games, each 1080p release in 2012 was extremely well done, and thus the results come in at a whopping 933p's. Ultimately, 2012 offered some decent software for PlayStation 3 users, but the system was beginning to feel dated at this point. Yet, even in the face of a new generation, the PlayStation 3 was about to have its best year for 1080p yet. And on the final episode, we'll explore these twilight years of the PS Triple before tallying everything up at the end to determine the top 3 years for 1080p gaming, while also determining how many of the games we covered today were 60 frames per second. So, don't miss it.